Coordinator Focus Ireland. You're very welcome to our first lunchtime talk of the year in partnership with the School of Social Work and Social Policy in Trinity College Dublin. For today's talk, we're delighted to feature an important piece of research entitled The Experience and Risk of Homelessness for People with Intellectual Disabilities and/or Autism and Their Families in Dublin. This research is a collaborative project between the Trinity Centre for Ageing and Intellectual Disability and the Daughters of Charity, and is funded by the National Disability Authority. The research is a mixed method study that explores the experiences of people with intellectual disabilities and/or autism spectrum disorder experiencing homelessness or homelessness risk. It uses a single service provider in Dublin, the Daughters of Charity Disability Support Services, and elicits views of staff and service users and their families. It is a very welcome contribution to research in the area of homelessness, as research with this group in particular is very limited in the Irish context. Estimating the number of individuals with intellectual disabilities and/or autism experiencing homelessness is not yet possible in Ireland. Coupled with that is an acknowledged invisibility of intellectual disabilities and/or autism due to high levels of non-diagnosis and limited supports. Joining us today to speak to the research are Dr. Mary Ann O'Donovan, Executive Director, Centre for Disability Studies, Ms. Emer Lynch, Principal Social Worker, Daughters of Charity Disability Support Services, Ms. Linda O'Donnell, Coordinator of Independent Living, Daughters of Charity Disability Support Services, Ms. Cathy Ann Kelly, Research Assistant on this project. We're also delighted to be joined by Martina Smith, CEO of HAIL, or Housing Association for Integrated Living, who will give her thoughts on the research, and that will follow the presentation today. Some general housekeeping before we get started. If everyone could please ensure that they're muted throughout the talk. If anyone has a question or a comment, please use the chat box function below, and hopefully if we have time at the end, we can get to those before 2 o'clock, and we'll monitor, my colleagues and I will monitor that throughout the hour. So I'll hand over now to Dr. Mary Ann O'Donovan, who will begin the presentation. Thanks, Mary.
Great. Thanks so much, Daniel. Thanks for that great introduction and for the opportunity to present on this work. It's really been a passion of the team now in getting this project going, and also in working through it through COVID and get it to this point where we can share the findings with people. So I'm delighted to be here with Cathy Ann, Emer and Linda to present on the project. And I'm just going to start with a quote from one of the participants, Nadia, who's a mother. She said, "If you do not have a home, you do not have anything. Any human being who is taken out of their house, it is like you are stripped bare naked. Everything is taken away from you. You feel the value of life is taken away from you. You just become like a nobody. You feel like you don't belong at all. You become another human being. Not the same human being. You can take away the money from me, take away all the things that I have, but leave me in the house." This is a really powerful statement, and I'm sure people working in Focus and across the sector are very familiar with that sentiment around the importance of home, the meaning of home, and the impact that inadequate housing, unstable housing has on not only the individual, but the family and greater society. So to start, I'd like to thank Nadia and all of the participants, the families, the individuals with intellectual disability and autism, and of course the staff within the Daughters of Charity. I think there's a problem with my sound. I'll move a little bit closer. Also like to thank the steering committee, Professor Mary McCarran, Professor Philip McCallion, Professor Christine Linehan and Patricia Cleary, who gave up their time and support, particularly around the change in research design during COVID and how we responded and continued with the research data collection at that time, and our funders, the National Disability Authority, through their research promotion scheme. So what did we set out to do? The main focus was to explore the experiences of homelessness and risk of homelessness for people with intellectual disability and/or autism and their families, with a particular interest in looking at the interplay of socioeconomic factors, cultural factors, ethnicity, with that experience of homelessness and disability. Also wanted to explore what were the challenges to having stable housing, what were the risks to being placed in inadequate housing, and also the risk factors of return to a residential setting, which is a particular concern for this population. So why did we focus on people with intellectual disability and autism? Well, as Daniel has said, there's limited research evidence in this space around the prevalence, but also the experiences and risk to homelessness. But frontline staff in the disability sector and in the homeless sector can attest to the fact that people with intellectual disability are among the homeless population. And this invisibility in the data is acknowledged in literature. One of the key things that we found, or that they talk about in the literature, and we did find within our own research, is that this breakdown in social support is a major risk factor for a return to residential settings. And as I said, this return to residential settings is really important for this group because we've had a history of segregation, a history of institutionalization of people with intellectual disability. More recently, housing policy has committed to decongregate and to support the movement of people with disabilities into the community through some kind of independent supported living model. There's also a lack of recognition or policy on adults with disability living with family carers. So family carers carry a huge amount of weight in terms of support and care. And as a person ages, whether it's the family carer aging, but also the person with intellectual disability aging, there can be limited choice around moving out of home, and people remain at home much longer than we do in any typical life course. Although my dad does have a tendency to call me boomerang for the number of times that I have moved home. Is tied into this housing as a basic human right, but also housing as a non-medical determinant of health, and looking at the impact on the person over the life course. The definition that we used was quite a broad definition, which we felt really reflected the experiences that we were seeing in the sector, particularly the experiences of those working with the Daughters of Charities. So this idea of it not just being about the roof over your head, but that insecurity, that inadequacy of housing, and living in temporary accommodation, couch surfing as well. So it's quite a broad definition of homelessness that guided this study. And I think you'll see why and how that is presenting as we work through the findings. So I'm going to hand over to Katyann. Katyann will go through the research design and some of the quantitative data. Thanks, Katyann.
Thanks very much for that, Marianne. Am I okay, Daniel? Can you hear me? Yeah, good. Okay, so I'm just going to very briefly go through the study design. So as Daniel said at the outset, it was a mixed method study and it was Dublin based, and it was a case study site using the Daughters of Charity Disability Support Services. This is an organisation that supports people with intellectual disability and or autism in a number of areas, including housing. So we sought the experiences of staff, families and individuals with disability who access services through the Daughters of Charity. Data collection comprised quantitative and qualitative research. So from the quantitative element, we looked at the Daughters of Charity Disability Service database and caseload data, which I'll just explain briefly in a few minutes. In a qualitative section, we looked at gaining the experience of 6 staff members within the Daughters of Charity who between them have 12 and 30 years experience working to support people with intellectual disability and autism over their life course in a number of areas, including housing. We managed to interview 5 participants who had a family member with an intellectual disability and or autism, and 4 participants who themselves had intellectual disability and or autism. All of these would have had experience of housing risk or homelessness risk or had actually lost their homes. So just very briefly, participant profile for the family members. The age was between 30 and 70 years. They had moved between 3 and 5 times in their life, and you can see from the slide there the types of transitions. And they had spent, their length of time spent homeless was between 1 and 4 years. For individuals, the age range was 40 to 60 years. They had moved between 1 and 8 times. And again, you can see the type of transition down there at the bottom of the slide, and they had spent an average length of time homeless between 1 and 2 years. I'm just going to talk very briefly about how we managed to get the quantitative data together. And this was really from a lot of work carried out by staff at the Daughters of Charity database. They looked at their records over a period of time. It was 10 years. And out of the 1,130 service users, only 3 would have actually been defined as homeless using the Irish definition, which is what is required under the National Intellectual Disability Database. However, as Marianne said at the beginning, staff report huge problems in this area. So a combination of the social work team, occupational therapists, and those working in supporting independent living reviewed the database and over a period of 10 years and looked at the number of people that would be classified as homelessness or risk of homelessness under the Feinstein definition, and found 145 cases. Of those cases, they were divided into 2 groups. One was the crisis group, which numbered 31. A crisis in this instance means that the care has completely broken down at this stage and that the person in question is either in a nursing home or hospital. Again, under an Irish definition, this would not be classified as homeless, but under the Feinstein definition, it would. Of those, only 2.7% are on the social housing list. There is then what we call a non-crisis group. However, there's 114 of those, and while we've used the term non-crisis, it doesn't mean that their situation is ideal. It is actually far from ideal in most instances. For that group, nearly 40% are on the social housing list, and a third of those are on the waiting list for 8 to 10 years, which is higher than the Dublin average of 7 years. Across both groups, the majority had moderate to severe profound intellectual disability, and also most of them had a secondary diagnosis of autism, a physical disability, or a chronic health condition. So the staff reported that the factors that were leading to homelessness risk were mostly due to issues with the landlord, and that's nearly 22%. The demands of caring accounted for 20%, or the house not adapted for disability, 12%, and aging carers and parents is another large number, 12.3% there, as well as assaults on carers, which is 7.9%. The factors leading to crisis admission, so this is where there's a complete breakdown in care, is for nearly half of all instances, is this carer simply unable to continue with the demands of caring, or the ill health of the parent or carer, as well as assaults on a carer. I'm going to hand over to Emer now for the qualitative findings, and she will hand over to Linda at some stage within that. Thanks, Emer.
Thanks, Cathy-Ann. Okay, as Cathy-Ann mentioned, a lot of our qualitative data came from the findings based on 6 of our staff within the Daughters of Charity, who gave written reflections on their experience over the years of supporting families with a relative with intellectual disability and autism regarding their housing or homelessness situation. And the interviews also conducted with 5 families who have a relative with ID or autism and 4 individuals themselves around their experience of housing and homelessness. I suppose, what did we find? We found that the participants in all groups, the staff, individuals and families, reported experiences that were common, factors contributing to the increased risk of homelessness for families, relatives and individuals. So you can see there we identify socioeconomic, cultural, ethnic issues, inadequate housing, a return to residential and housing instability, and we look at them in a little bit more detail now. So it's probably widely known that people with intellectual disability and their families are much more likely to experience multiple disadvantage and poverty. For example, many of the families we work with may be single parents to a child or adult with disability. They may be from a different ethnic background, and the caring required by children and adults with intellectual disability and autism frequently prevents participation in employment by parents, and therefore create a reliance on social welfare. This multiple disadvantage seriously impacts on one's ability to access housing. And this is a quote from one of the staff members who gave their reflection for the study. Okay. So in our work, we come across many inadequate and inappropriate housing situations that exacerbate the difficulties for the person with disability and for their families. I suppose this is just one quote that describes a bed sit in Dublin where a mother and her child with autism share a bed. The bed sit is so damp, their clothes have to be kept in flip-lock boxes. They have been 7 years on the housing list in this bed sit, and this young child continues to experience daily episodes of frustration and display behaviours that challenge stemming from sensory needs brought on by the cold, dark, and cramped environment in which he lives. His mum continues to experience ongoing stress and anxiety managing this situation in such an inappropriate setting, trying to maintain her safety while he engages in self-harming, attempts to abscond, shouting, banging walls, biting, kicking, and hitting her. Okay, looking at housing instability. The families are so dependent on the private rented market. There is little in the way of security of tenure, and relationships with landlords can be fraught with tensions. Often complaints from neighbours where there is noise at night from a child with autism, jumping, banging, slamming, and not sleeping. Families are unable to make minor adjustments or modifications and have to deal with the dread of landlord visits, which expose the damage to property, which may have been the result of some behaviours, for example, holes in walls and doors. Okay, housing stability is so important for all, but we would like to explain a little bit how housing stability is so important for the families we work with intellectual disability and autism. When families are offered housing outside the community they are accustomed to, this incurs huge upheaval. You can see on this slide how a staff member adds comments that access to service is so important for individuals and families, and noting that there is a fear around moving out of a catchment area and subsequent loss of services. We find this a lot, that with the transient and insecure nature of private renting, there is an absence of security of tenure, which causes an inability for families to become part of a community. Knowing and being known by your service provider, all the therapists, being known in your community, the ease of access to your GP, your chemist, your post office, your local shops, precious schools, gives stability to parents and siblings and service users. What we found is that when families have to move, either through notice to quit from their landlord and ensuing homeless, the sofa surfing, the experience of hubs, hostels, or being offered local authority accommodation outside your established community is such a huge upheaval and source of distress to each and every one of the individuals in their family. Crisis admissions, of which we recorded 31, as Kathy-Ann referred to, occurred for a various number of reasons, mainly the result of a carer being unable to continue caring. This can be through illness or death of carer, or also because the carer is just unable to carry out the demands of caring. Again, this causes such huge instability for the service user, who not only loses their parent, their carer, their home, and sometimes they lose their community and their friendships because they may be offered a placement in a different area or even in a different provider that is far away. Okay, so now we look at family findings. Again, as I mentioned earlier, the reports from families share much commonality with the staff findings re the drivers of homelessness. So looking at the socioeconomic, cultural and ethnic issues, we found that 4 of the 5 family carers who participated in the study were unemployed, and 3 of the 5 families who participated were new to Ireland. They had all sought and been granted asylum or refugee status. In this slide, we hear from Maria, who is a mum in her 60s. Her daughter with ID had an accident that resulted in mobility issues, and the physical environment at home was unable to support her return. This service user spent over a year in a hospital bed, in a dementia ward in a general hospital, while her elderly parents took turns every night sleeping beside her. Again, this person would not have been reported as homeless. We would come across many examples of inadequate accommodation, and family size coupled with economic dependence has led to an over-reliance on the private rental market. 3 of the 5 families interviewed became homeless as a result of the landlord giving notice to quit, and the failure to find alternative accommodation has led to emergency accommodation, i.e. hubs, hostels, hotels and sofa surfing. Here we hear from Aliki, a dad who is married with 2 children under 10, one of whom is totally dependent for all her care needs. He describes spending 6 months trying to find a new home to rent for himself, his wife and 2 daughters, living in a hotel room altogether with no cooking facilities, with 2 of his children, one of whom has feeding issues and dietary requirements and also a physical ID. This family were homeless for 3.5 years and had several moves during this time. In a further 2 instances, the rented home that the family were living in was already too small to accommodate their growing family needs, and they were served with notice to quit. Another mum, Aliki, who is married with 3 children, 2 of whom have special needs. One is a teenage boy with autism, and one was a new baby with Down syndrome, talks of a similar difficulty. Having failed to secure a rented property, 2 of the families were referred to a family hub and hotel. In both cases, the family stayed there for more than 3.5 years. One further parent refused emergency accommodation and opted to couch surf, as moving out of the area would have meant losing the place her child had in his autism specific school. Each of these temporary solutions give rise to numerous issues, including concerns around access to normal family routines, the lack of space leading to a regression in behaviours and serious mental health issues for parents. We have met families who talk about difficulty of keeping routines in hotels and hostels, the lack of access to kitchen except at certain times, children with eating requirements, not being able to keep their religious requirements, access to a washing machine at restricted times where young adults with autism have regressed because of the loss of routine and have become wetting and soiling. Trying to keep children with autism quiet and contained in cramped spaces, or trying to maintain schools for children with disability and their siblings, driving backwards and forwards from maybe another county to go to school. This mum, Nadia, describes how she was sofa surfing. She was staying out the whole day. She describes trying to manage her son's distress after they had been evicted and were couch surfing. Nadia was out all day to avoid the breakdown of the hospitality of one friend who had given the family a room in her house for the family of 4. Her son was crying all day and wanted to go home to the house that they had left behind because he did not understand that they had been evicted. Parents talk about the psychological effects of inappropriate housing and homelessness. Here again, Nadia describes what it was like, the depression and the anxiety, and 2 of the parents who were interviewed expressed suicidal ideation. For all the families and individuals, it was very evident the lack of control, the lack of choice, and coercion is such a huge issue. People just don't have choices and feel backed into a corner to take whatever they're offered. Here, Helen describes the difficulty of accessing residential care for her sister, who was being cared for by their 81-year-old father. This lady had an accident and was in hospital, and at the same time, her 81-year-old dad was hospitalised also with heart problems. The mum had died several years earlier, and dad's health had been deteriorating. This lady, again, was in a hospital bed for over a year. Her mobility was fine, she was quite able, but she was offered a nursing home in a brain injury unit for adults under 65. And Helen spoke about feeling that you just don't have any choices, so you don't know whether to take the first thing you're offered or wait it out. And here we look at what is a home and what does it mean to the families who participated. Indeed, I think with COVID, we've all come to appreciate the comforts of our homes even more, and also to realise how inadequate housing seriously exacerbates any difficulties these families are experiencing. None of the families interviewed wanted a castle with a swimming pool. None of them wanted jacuzzis. All people wanted here was home, a safe place. And Aliki describes enjoying their home after it was allocated because it's safe and they have space to interact and have normal family routines, and this gives them independence. Okay, now I'm going to hand over to Linda.
So we looked at individual participants and what their findings are. I supported 6 people to move out of the residential services that they lived in with supports by the Daughters of Charity. These individuals lived in community housing, but they had expressed a desire to live a more independent life in a place of their own choosing through their PCPs. So Genio funding had come up and offered will provide it to services if they had anything creative to do. So we applied and was successful in supporting the 6 individuals. So we set off, well, on their journey, you know, signed the documentation with the council, which is very difficult for people that have very poor reading skills. But anyway, they all set up or signed up with the council, and were able to rent a place. Of course, when we started, this was back in 2013, earlier even, and we were in the middle of a recession and a housing crisis. But we did manage to secure 6 properties for each individual. But out of the 6, unfortunately, 3 of them became homeless. And after living in one woman, Julie, she lived in a place of her own, loved the area. It was very familiar to her. She felt safe and secure. And unfortunately, after 3 years, she had to leave because the landlord had to sell the property. And so she had to, unfortunately, move back into residential services, which she describes here as very depressing. When we went, firstly, she had to go and, you know, deem herself homeless to the council. And at the counter there, her quote is, they said to her, you could go back, I'd go back to my aunties or go to a homeless hostel. I didn't want to do either of them, you see. They said I wouldn't be safe in the hostel, that they wouldn't recommend it. And back to congregated setting, yeah, I wasn't happy with that. And that was our only option at that time. She became very depressed there, and but she got through it. Then we went on, I supported a man in his 40s, and he shared a room in a community house with another man who was older than him. And now Graham had been offered to do the Genio project and live a more independent life, but he declined to do this. At the time, he became very nervous. But I think he since has something better for himself and will eventually no longer be sharing that room. I suppose while it's great for people to move out and live a life of their own choosing, it has huge challenges. You know, the area is familiar to them. They need people, you know, they need to be around people that will look out for them. Communities, you know, is hugely important. Like Julie said, the reason she loves her own independence, to be in her own apartment, is because she has the freedom to go in and out as she pleases, to listen to music whenever she wants, to play it as she wants, obviously not upsetting the neighbours, but she enjoys the freedom, and having her feet to the floor is hugely important.
Thanks very much, Linda. And I think if we'd go back now to Emer, just to very briefly, because I think we're running tight on time, Emer, so you might very briefly go through the findings. Is that okay? Daniel, can you click on mute Emer there?
That's right. Yeah. Sorry.
There we go.
Thanks very much.
You can take your time, Emer, as well. There's no rush if you want to.
Okay.
Take your time.
Thanks so much. I suppose briefly we'll go through what we found. I won't go through them all, but overall you probably get the idea that the barriers that, you know, individuals and families are facing, and the issues that, you know, they require a lot of support around. I mean, obviously for yourselves, well, you would find, as we found, there's an over-reliance on private rental accommodation. And due to economic dependence, this over-reliance on private rented leads to a lot of instability of tenure and a repeated cycle of homelessness, which we found that some of the families had become homeless more than once, sometimes twice and 3 times. As Linda pointed out also, the lack of suitable private rented accommodation was the primary reason that caused the return to residential. As I referred to earlier, we found multiple examples of substandard and inappropriate accommodation. We found many damp, mouldy, rodent-infested, cramped living conditions that do not allow the individual with disability to enjoy their home, to maximise the potential that they have, to make the progress that they could make, or to participate positively in their own home. With regard to what people with disabilities need to make a house a home, we found a lack of awareness and understanding of the needs of people with ID and intellectual disability, with ID, autism, and physical disabilities. We found a huge risk of care crisis. I suppose we refer to the 31 that we came across, where parents are aging, they're suffering their own ill health. You know, it's not the same anymore. They don't have siblings who can take over care, or they simply are unable to carry out the care duties, and a large number of subsequent emergency accommodation placements required. I have referred already to unsuitable accommodation, and we found this across the board, in privately owned homes, in private rented homes, in local authority accommodation, and in emergency accommodation. We found that families don't have space for their son or daughter's equipment, or hoists, or wheelchairs for standing frames. We came across families who were storing equipment on balconies, who had to work with therapists to resize the equipment to get smaller equipment into their homes, with steps up to accommodation with children and adults in wheelchairs. We found parents carrying children on their backs up and down stairs. We found that there was no space or garden for people with autism to regulate their sensory issues, no space for siblings to get a night's sleep, to do their homework in peace, or to have friends over. Some examples that come to mind: one of the families that I worked with was a family of 9 in a 3-bedroom house, where an adult with autism, because of his need for space, when he came home from day service, would pull his jacket over his head and stay in the hot press until everybody went to bed. We also work with a family where a mum had 2 adult children in wheelchairs, and although they have been given an adapted home by the council, they have to live in their bedroom and can only eat in the kitchen one at a time, because their wheelchairs both cannot be accommodated in the kitchen. The whole family cannot be together in one room at any time. Practical difficulties Linda's referred to, and she's the navigation of complex and bureaucratic housing system, communication difficulties, and discrimination. Lack of awareness of needs. I suppose what we found is that, you know, a house doesn't automatically make a home. Bricks and mortars do not make a home. We found the lack of awareness and need from housing agencies and local authorities, especially around the needs of people with IT and autism and attendant physical disabilities. I suppose what we found is that everybody does their best and gives what the best of what they have to give, but it's just actually still trying to fit round pegs into square holes, and it's not sustainable, and situations break down. But offering traditional solutions and inappropriate housing placements to people that we wouldn't take or choose to take ourselves. A huge lack of consultation and choice. Again, offering people maybe the best of what we have to offer, but it actually really doesn't fit their needs or choices. But then people become known as, oh, they're fussy, or they're also not allowed to decline more than once, so they go back down to the end of the housing list. So there was a huge factor of the lack of consultation and choice around housing. Personal factors we referred to already: the care crisis, the increase in the demands of caring, where carers are unable to deliver those, the needs of caring, the decreasing health, the advancing age of family carers, and the emergency accommodation that families and individuals end up in, leading to a loss of family routine, the loss of the services and the community that they've known all their lives, and the behavioural issues and the regression in children that this loss of routine can incur. Briefly looking at social factors, across the spectrum of families and individuals all express stigma, loneliness, exclusion, marginalisation, and lack of individualised supports. And Linda would have talked about the lack of individualised supports for people who do not want to live in traditional residential settings and want to set up a life on their own. Okay. As a
Thank
brief.
you very much for that, Emer. So I suppose looking at the whole study then, it's important for people with intellectual disability as well as autism to see that housing is a basic human right, which is absent from Irish housing and health policy. But certainly for the people in this study, home is very important as part of a social network, and that includes being close to services and being close to family. Home is important as a place of independence where they can live their own lives, and home needs to be a safe space most of all. As a result of the study, the recommendations include this year, 2021, the National Housing Policy for Persons with Disabilities is being developed, and we would like to see it have a specific focus on people and families with intellectual disability or autism, and that this should be framed by a life course and human rights perspectives. As both Emer and Linda have attested, there are a number of adult children living at home with intellectual disability or autism, and there is no recognition of their need to want to live independently. The policy, if it is being implemented, needs to be adequately resourced. As both Linda and Emer again have attested, there are a number of very heavily bureaucratic and complicated systems around accessing the housing private rental market, and that needs to be simplified, streamlined, and there needs to be accessible material for people with intellectual disability and autism. A general need for education and training, particularly amongst statutory housing and disability services, as well as for landlords operating in the private rental market. In 2019, the National Disability Authority provided a framework for universal design living for new housing. This needs to be revisited. It's currently with the Department of Local Planning, Housing and Government. And on emergency accommodation, while I think we'd all agree that emergency accommodation is in no way desirable for any individual or family, certainly from the evidence of both Emer and Linda and other people working within the Daughters of Charity, it is entirely unsuitable for people with autism or intellectual disability and their families. Again, based on social worker reflections, there is a need to revise eligibility criteria for income thresholds, both for housing and for housing adaptation. And at a national level, there is a need to provide greater protection from eviction. And we can see that this is being done because it's being done in the moment with COVID. So there's no reason why it can't be continued for certain sections of the population. We also need, because there is no evidence of the actual prevalence of homelessness risk or homelessness on a national level for people with intellectual disability and or autism. So that's something we really need to get working on. And also there needs to be a promotion generally for care in the community for people with intellectual disability and autism. And this can only be achieved with the engagement of community staff and service users in participatory dialogue. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I want to thank everybody involved in the study, the research team, the Daughters of Charity, Trinity Centre for Intellectual Ageing and Intellectual Disability, and the funders National Disability Authority. And in particular, I want to thank Focus Ireland for giving us this opportunity to talk about our research today. I'm going to hand back over to you, Daniel. Thanks again.
Thanks very much, Kathy-Ann, and thanks to all the other speakers. Very, very comprehensive, very engaging presentation. And I think it really showcased well the various elements of the research. And I found some of those quotes from the families particularly powerful, really captured the lived experience. And as many people at this webinar will be familiar with, showcase those systemic failures in the housing system as well that can impact people. I found as well it was very useful from a Focus Ireland perspective in the research work that we do, and particularly around our research series on families and how we might better investigate intellectual disability in that research series and the impact that has on families and carers as well. So I found it really, really useful and engaging. So next we're going to have a response from Martina Smith, who is CEO of HALE. Martina, when you're ready, thanks.
Great, thank you, Daniel. I just want to acknowledge the presentation there. That was a really great presentation, and as you say, quite heartbreaking. Some of the stories there from people with lived experience, and it is such an important discussion. And just to say what great work the Daughters of Charity are doing there as well. At HALE, we provide housing and support to people with severe and enduring mental health difficulties, and have been doing so for a number of years. I've been with HALE now 3 years, and I'm very aware of us being contacted on quite a regular basis by people, by worried families about the future, in particular if they have young children growing up with autism and where they will live, and the future services and support for them. We have, I think, probably one of the solutions to this issue going forward, and what we focus on in Hale really is around independent living. We do have independent living and we do have shared accommodation, but what's important for us, not only providing the housing, is providing the right supports and the expertise, and that sort of model, you know, works quite well. We've got over 400 of our own tenancies at the moment. About 70% of those are for people with severe and enduring mental health difficulties, and we've got a very low turnover in our tenants and tenancies. And then we've also got a very high tenancy sustainment in services that we provide to other organisations, other tenures. So that definitely is a model that can work and should be able to work as well for this cohort. A lot of what we do is around community living and integration, and it's a non-medical model. It's tenancy sustainment. It focuses on good quality housing and keeping the person in their tenancy. We carried out our own evaluation in 2019 on our services, and you know, the messages are very, very similar to what's coming across in this study as well, in that people need security of tenure. They need the right support to stay in that tenure, and they really appreciated the non-medical model, that that they have somebody else that is a support to them, but isn't necessarily medicating them, that is really helping them on just day-to-day living. So I think that's important as well in terms of the future. Now, obviously, the issue going forward is getting the resources to do that. And that has to be backed by government. It has to be backed by the Department of Housing, by the HSE, by the DRHE. And I think what's really important now is this study, and is a stepping stone to make sure that people get their voice heard and that funding is made available for the provision of housing and support. I know the NDA and myself were both on the oversight group that is working on the National Housing Strategy for People with Disabilities, and I'll certainly be raising that there in terms of just clicking all those things together, getting the housing, getting the good quality housing, and getting the right supports. I think that's it really for me, and well done.
Thanks, Martina. Yeah, as you say, it's kind of those pieces of the puzzle, isn't it? Getting those together, housing, and the right type of supports as well. And there are models that are successful out there in terms of supporting people in their tenancies and importantly that security of tenure. So we have some time now at the end where we will take some questions, and there was a question in the chat box there from Aliki in Waterford. Adele says experiences in Waterford Homeless Action Team is that often a homeless person with a suspected intellectual disability may not be linked to a disability service and may never have been assessed, or may never been assessed in childhood but not in receipt of a service as an adult. It seems that only persons with a moderate to severe disability are eligible for adult services. Is this correct? Would any of the research team be able to speak to that question?
I think I'll leave that question to Emer. Emer would be most familiar with that.
I think traditionally, Adele is right that people with, moderate, severe and profound disabilities would be linked to service providers. I think there is some changes in the legislation with progressing children's disabilities, that children with mild intellectual disability are linked to service providers, albeit with very, very stretched resources and very stretched teams. However, I think it would be something that comes up in the homeless services all the time, that adults with mild ID who were never linked to any services end up in homeless services and in prisons. And unfortunately, I'm not sure if the resources are there like they could be referred for assessment, but again, it's all back down to resources. The need is there, but people would need to have an assessment and would not probably at that stage of their life want to be linked to service providers. So it's back to individualized supports that Linda is talking about, you know, and social role valorization. What type of a life does that person want to lead? But I doubt people want to return to an actual service provider at that stage either. I don't know if any of my colleagues would have any comments on that.
No, I think it kind of underlines the importance of the need to actually, you know, identify people with intellectual disability and autism who are perhaps, you know, marginalized, as you say, in prisons and in homelessness service, who've never been diagnosed. We don't have a national statistic for prevalence of any of that. And that's something that's really important because we need to be able to plan. And at the moment, you know, it's like planning for a black hole. You don't know how many people need or might need it coming forward, you know, going forward. So trying to get those statistics together is really crucial, I think.
And also just to say that like echoing what Emer was saying, that services like ourselves don't typically give a service to people with a mild disability. So that they wouldn't, you know, I know myself, I'm looking at referring someone to County Meath, and I looked at their criteria, and it had to be moderate, or if it was mild, they had to have a whole load of other issues as well. So it's you know, it's fairly standard across the country. I think that the services for people with intellectual disability for adults generally just cater for people moderate upwards.
Thanks. I have a question, Kathy-Ann, about the mentioned repeated cycles of homelessness experienced by some of the participants in the research. Was that intergenerational, or was it people who were moving in and out of homelessness?
It was. I'll probably leave that one back to Emer or Linda, because it's not intergenerational. It is really that, you know, the same problem happens over and over again. So particularly for families with a child with autism, where the child is maybe destructive, and the landlord comes in and sees damage and just gives notice to quit, or maybe they're living in an area where the other neighbours might be living in like a flat where the child is making a lot of noise, and that's causing a lot of disruption. So again, the landlord is contacted, and then maybe Emer could give examples of other ones where there's repeated cycles of.
Yeah, I think several of the families that we work with would have expressed how they would have been given notice to quit because maybe what the neighbours would have perceived as antisocial behaviour from their son or daughter with autism. One woman in particular who would have said that she went through a long period of sofa surfing and emergency accommodation, and when she did receive a home from the local authority, which was a lovely house, but the fact that it was terraced, the neighbours on both sides began to complain again about the noise during the night. And she was one of the participants. She was due to be a participant in our study, but she had just gotten notice to quit again at the time of the study starting. So there is repeated cycles of insecurity of tenure for people where they have a son or daughter with disability or autism, because of the perception of the neighbours, maybe that they're, you know, the noise is keeping their kids awake, or so we would have a lot of families, and also the economic dependence on private rental, that if the landlord decides to give notice to quit, as you would have experienced obviously in Focus as well, finding suitable accommodation is just so hard, affordable accommodation, and especially if you're trying to find accommodation that meets the needs of your son or daughter. And many of our families couldn't even go to viewings because they can't take their children to queue. They won't queue, they won't be quiet in a queue. If they're a single parent, they've nobody to mind their child with autism. So it's just a repeated cycle.
So we have a few minutes left, so I'd ask if anybody at the webinar has a question, they can post it in the chat box below. But from reading the research report, I know that it was mentioned that this could be a stepping stone for some further research in the area. With the research team, is there any particular avenue that you feel would be worthwhile exploring in this area, say in a larger research study?
I think one of the things, and I'll ask for backup with Emer and Lynn on this, one of the things that we really missed in this study because of COVID was we don't have the voice of people with moderate to severe or profound intellectual disability and or autism. The plan was that we would kind of get a broad spectrum of people, but because we had to move away from one-to-one interviews to telephone or WhatsApp chats and use technology to do that, we really only have the voice of people with, I suppose, mild to moderate intellectual disability. So it'll be really important that we get the views of other people. And I think the other area that we'd like to see more research on is this issue of adult children living at home with their parents who are not, it's not acknowledged that they want to move out of home. Maybe the parents don't want them to, or the parents have concerns, but certainly they're not acknowledged in policy. It's literally, and that's what Emer would say, and Linda, you know, certainly during COVID, there was instances of parents in their 80s who had to get letters from the Gardaí to be able to take their child, get permission to take their adult child out for a walk, you know, their 50-year-old son, just to bring them out for a walk to have exercise, you know, and that's, I'll let Emer speak more on that. She has a better sense of.
Yeah, we would have a number of parents in their 70s and 80s, I suppose, caring for adult children at home. And I suppose it can be mixed, as you say. Some of the adult children would make representation, advocate on their own behalf that they want to move out of home. But I suppose parents are used to the traditional model of a service provided residential, whereas I suppose their son or daughter might want to live in a house or an apartment with 2 or 3 peers, which would be more the model that Linda is promoting. And supporting, and obviously we're trying to extend that model across the service, you know, trying to look at what kind of the good life and what kind of a life do people want to lead and move away from traditional models. But it's just, I suppose that's one of the huge issues looking at aging carers, and I have discussed this, you know, when I was lucky to be part of the previous council group on looking at the housing policy for people with disabilities, that people who live at home who are maybe assaulting their parents, who are very inappropriately housed, who are at risk of breakdown, aren't held on a database anywhere as, you know, homeless. And I suppose that's why the FANSA definition was so appealing to us, because it does, you know, even in the national strategy for housing people with disabilities, it mentions that if your home is inadequate or doesn't meet your needs, you are technically homeless. So we'd have so many people. So that's what I'd like to see myself, and even with the new database that's replacing the National Intellectual Disability Database, if we could record those statistics where people are inadequately housed, inappropriately housed, that they aren't able to maximise their potential because of the environment, or that the environment is causing further distress to them, if that could be recorded somewhere, because those statistics are just lost.
Thanks, Emer. So we've no further questions I can see in the chat box, so I might wrap it up. And I just want to say thanks to our speakers today, to Mary, Emer, Linda, Katiana and Martina for a really engaging and interesting presentation. And to congratulate them on their work in producing this piece of research, because I know it was tough last year on the impact of COVID. I think all researchers who worked last year, you know, understand how difficult it can be to produce a piece of research in the current environment. So congratulations to you all. I just want to thank as well my colleagues for supporting the event today, and thank everyone for attending as well. And just to say that the research is available on the NDA website, I believe. So people can access it there. So thanks again everyone for attending, and hopefully see you soon at the next lunchtime talk. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thanks.